Thanks, Phil. Hi, I'm Bounty. I'll be chairing the first session. This session will focus on machine learning for medical research applications. From early diagnosis of neurodegenerative diseases through automatic labeling of medical images, all the way to predicting protein structures from amino acid sequences. It is no understatement that AI and ML have revolutionized the medical research field, and they will revolutionize the medical applications in hospitals as well. It's what an exciting time. This session will last until 11:30. The first speaker today is Professor Chris Williams, who, due to COVID concerns, will be joining us online. Chris Williams is a professor of machine learning and director of research in the School of Informatics at the University of Edinburgh. He's interested in a wide range of theoretical and practical issues in machine learning, statistical pattern recognition, and probabilistic graphical models. In particular, him and his group focus on visual object recognition and image understanding, models for understanding time series, AI for data analytics and for science, unsupervised learning, and Gaussian processes. In his talk, Professor Williams will discuss assisting scientific discovery with AI. He will then discuss the use of multi-task dynamical systems, which is applications in patient drug response, and multi-task pharmacodynamic modeling. With that out of the way, Professor Williams, the floor is yours.
Lovely, thank you. Good morning. Thank you to the organizers for the invitation. Let me just, first of all, check, can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, great, good. Okay, so thanks. Yeah, so I'm sorry I can't be there in person, but and it looks like it's going to be a great meeting, so I'm sorry to miss that, but I hope you can at least gain something from a virtual presentation. So yeah, let me now just go into full screen on this. Okay, yeah. So I really want to talk in two parts, and the first one is a sort of general question about assisting scientific discovery with AI. So I think when you do that, you want to think, well, what is the process of scientific discovery? And the sort of diagram you often see is something like this. This one is from a paper by Hiroaki Kitano from 2016. And maybe if we start on the top left, we've got some hypotheses that are generated. Going across to the right, we have experiments. Those produce results that go to papers and databases. And in some sense, we might get that scientific knowledge into an AI system if we wanted at least to automate scientific discovery. And then there's this sort of feedback loops, and there are various processes going forward and back. And one of the other interesting things about this diagram is it has this sort of blue and green divisions of these ellipses. And basically the blue is sort of false information or false erroneous experiments and things like this. So of course it's important to bear in mind that, yeah, that there can be mistakes in the scientific literature, as we know. Another diagram of a similar nature is from IBM, from their Science and Technology Outlook in 2021. And the thing I like about this diagram is sort of on the left here, it has a question, because I think that actually really a lot of science starts with a question. And we don't always necessarily come to a hypothesis, at least in more sort of discovery science, but we certainly have a question. So here we have a question. We might want to do a study. We might want to basically extract, integrate, and reason with knowledge that's relevant to that question. That may lead to a hypothesis. And then we maybe do some experimental testing. We need to analyze those results into this assess, and then report them, say usually by writing a paper. And there's this sort of, again, this cycle of discovery. If that was a bit small, I've just redrawn the figure here so you're very clear about those different stages: question, study, hypothesize, test, assess, report. I think that, as I just alluded to, not everything necessarily fits into hypothesis-driven science. So sometimes people want to make a distinction between, say, descriptive science and hypothesis-driven, I kind of like this, the figure on the right here from Dunn and Munro, where they talk about hypothesis testing and hypothesis generating. And often in this more discovery-based science, when we may not actually have a particular hypothesis, we might be trying to understand and describe, say nature or some part of nature. And we can also have this distinction between descriptive and experimental. And there, what they mean is really, by experimental, they mean sort of making interventions. So if we think about the causal literature and we distinguish between observations and interventions, then often in experiments, what we're doing is we're trying to intervene on the system in certain ways. But of course, there can actually be natural experiments that arise. So one may not actually have to do experimental manipulations of a system in order to actually do experiments. We may be fortunate that those arise for us. And I think this idea also that descriptive and hypothesis-driven research should be seen as complementary and iterative rather than as, you know, sort of distinctive things, I think is sensible. So maybe just looking at a few examples of work in these different areas. So quite a lot of what I do as a machine learner is probably could be classed as discovery science. So one nice example here is this paper, Counting in the Wild, by Arteta et al. from Andrew Zisserman's group in Oxford, where we might be looking at, I think, penguins, and we're actually, you know, trying to track them and count them and so on. And so, you know, maybe for biologists, we actually need to get, you know, to turn, you know, the video into something much more useful and analyze that data. And then once we have that raw data about, say, counts of penguins in certain areas, we might actually be able to generate hypotheses and so on. So in fact, there can be, you know, this process when we're actually trying to understand the data. And in similar ways, we might want to generate network models consistent with experimental data. And then, you know, one might then want to actually may have to make experiments to differentiate these hypotheses and so on. So I think there's certainly a lot of space for that kind of work. If we look at assessment, so if we remember that those 6 stages that I showed you, then the assessment, essentially the analysis of experiments. So one nice thing that's happened over the last few years is that there's this method called cryo-EM, where we basically, you know, it's a low temperature, we sort of freeze a sample, and then we want to determine its structure. And there's been a lot of work on actually different algorithms to improve that process. So, you know, we actually had to, well, the community has to develop algorithms to address that problem of structure determination from cryo-EM data. And another example could be Bayesian methodology to estimate parameters with uncertainty. So I've taken one here about magnetar variability in astrophysics, but there are many examples. We also talk about hypothesization, and certainly in things like experimental design, we might have examples where we want to actually explore a design space, and maybe based on surrogates like a Gaussian process model of the expected utility of various different configurations, we want to explore that space. And so this first example is around that, and the second is around designing molecules with desired properties. So basically growing a molecule with an autoregressive model, but conditioning on specific chemical and structural properties you want to achieve. Going back actually quite a long way into the sort of history of AI, we may also, so this is Pat Langley from 1981, we may want to, say, rediscover Kepler's laws and in a data-driven way. So that's a rather older example of hypothesizing a space, essentially, of equations which the planetary motions might obey, and then actually and identifying which one fits with the data. Of course, we talk about reporting, and of course, we're very familiar with writing papers. That's what a lot of our life as scientists is around. Well, of course, creating the creating the knowledge and then reporting it. But of course, if you want to think about actually how this process might be automated, then one might want to actually extract the knowledge in the paper, which is in natural language, into knowledge bases, ontologies, networks, etc. And we've seen also that there can be erroneous results that are reported in the literature, and also perhaps often underspecified results. One may not always give the full details of exactly how something was achieved. And so there may need to be some knowledge cleaning in this. And so, as with more general knowledge extraction from natural language, we might want to actually try and achieve that if one wanted to build an automated scientist. Of course, one also needs to, once you've identified that question, we want to extract, integrate, and reason with relevant knowledge. So that, again, is kind of going into that knowledge base. And it's sort of interesting to reflect how we as scientists often, when we're starting with a new question, we do a literature search, and how we follow literature in order to achieve these things. One other thing that is worth mentioning here is that actually, so I'm thinking of a study called Tundra Traits by Bjorkman and Al. What this is about is assessing the effects of climate change on vegetation in the Arctic. And so they wanted to bring together a lot of data sets from different places, and then they had a lot of issues about sort of integrating those data sets, which maybe use different terminology or possibly different units and all these things. So there's a lot of work that often needs to go on when one integrates data from different sources. And I've actually worked quite a lot on this in the study at the Alan Turing Institute over the last few years. At least the issues and problems around that, I wouldn't say that we certainly haven't solved all those issues, although we have created some tools that can be helpful in this process. And I think perhaps the hardest thing to do, as probably you've come across, is that if one can identify sort of connections between parallel strands of research in different literatures, and when you can actually connect those things, sometimes that's very interesting and can lead to new insights. Of course, one can also try to automate the whole scientific process. So going back as far as 2004, Ross King's group came up with the robot scientist that carries out a full cycle, including running the experiments using laboratory robotics for of course, a fairly restricted domain. So I guess that's taking that cycle that we talked about and looking at the various aspects of it and seeing where AI and machine learning methods can help. So, of course, one thing that's been very much in the news over the last year or so is AlphaFold. And so, how much of science can we do as a sort of prediction problem? Okay, so I think AlphaFold is a very clever choice of a target problem, with a clear objective function. We know what we're trying to optimize. And I guess there, if we can reliably predict 3D structure from the input sequence, then maybe that's fine. We don't need to know sort of maybe the details of how that works. Of course, we might like to know, but maybe here prediction is enough. But I guess it's important to say that, probably, well, I'm sure that not all of science is like this. And, often we want to work within a sort of a theoretical framework. And for example, we see things like physics-informed machine learning that maybe imposes certain physical laws or constraints on the system to make sure that it obeys essentially that knowledge that we have already. Because, when we tackle these problems, there is a body of prior knowledge that might even be called a theory in some sciences where we're trying to actually integrate and work with that. Sometimes we just want to do data analysis, and that can be helpful, but sometimes we want to integrate machine learning methods and AI methods with domain knowledge. Other thing I'd like to talk about here is how AI for research works in universities. And at least I can only talk about our experience in Edinburgh, and what we've done over the last few years is to create something that's called the Data Science Unit, led by Dr. Simon Seth. If we were doing it now, we might call it the AI for Science Unit. But basically, how that works is we're really often, it's domain scientists who are coming to data scientists and machine learners and say, are there ways in which that you can help us? And of course, often that starts with state-of-the-art methods, simple baselines. One doesn't always need to develop a new model for some problems. And of course, actually, the introduction of sort of looking at problems from data science or AI perspectives can introduce this change of perspective, which might be called computational thinking. That phrase is from Jeanette Wing. And so I think it's kind of interesting to see how this works, at least for us. And so the Data Science Unit runs a sort of clinic to discuss how AI might help. And it's kind of like there have been statistical clinics going on for a long time, but maybe there's a slightly different focus on the kinds of methods that can be used here. And of course, also training courses on how to apply machine learning and AI techniques in science. And one of the things that the Data Science Unit is doing as well is that we have a number of data scientists who can be deployed to work, say, fractionally part-time on different funded projects. So that's one way in which that knowledge about how data science can be applied in the scientific domain can be sort of built up, and that group can build up a knowledge of that. And of course, that's what we're doing in Edinburgh, but I'm sure there are similar structures at other universities. In fact, I know that's the case. And I guess, of course, also important to say, and I think you're going to see a lot of this today, that some of these interactions can lead to novel methodology. So although we might start with state of the art, often, it's when you discuss these things in more detail, you say, well, that isn't quite right. We actually, because of this constraint or this issue, we actually want to do it this way, and that can lead to novel methodology. So I think that's a very interesting and rewarding thing that we can see. So maybe just to summarize this part of the talk, I think it's important to think of AI for assisting scientific discovery. We can think about the full automation of that, but I think that's probably quite a long way away. And also, domain scientists maybe not particularly keen to have their as it were, the stuff they enjoy doing automated. As I say, I think that's a long way away. But I think the ways in which AI can assist are actually the most interesting things to talk about. And I guess perhaps I've tried to talk about the cycle of scientific discovery, and to think about where AI can help in that. And I've also just mentioned how to promote this kind of work within universities. Well, one way to promote that, I'd be interested to hear how things are being done in Glasgow. Okay, so let me stop these set of slides here and move on to the other part of my talk. So let me see if I can, oh, yeah. Let me now share the screen again with the correct slides for this part. Okay. So let me just check again. Can you see the slides called Multi-task Dynamical Systems?
Yes.
Okay, great. Okay, so thanks. Okay, so having talked about in general about AI to assist scientific discovery, I'd like to talk about some specific work that I did with my PhD student, Alex Bird, and also Chris Hawthorne, who's at the Queen Elizabeth University Hospital nearby to you there in Glasgow, and also at the University of Glasgow. And yeah, I've also worked on a bunch of other machine learning for science projects, intensive care unit monitoring, inference for wind fields, cleaning astronomical sky survey databases with Huff transforms, detecting malaria parasites in images, estimating bacterial load in confocal microscopy and tracking mice and quantification of their behavioral patterns from video data. So yeah, there's a lot of different kind of ML for science projects I've worked on, but the one I want to talk about today is this one essentially on multi-task dynamical systems. And the motivation for this is that, so we're modeling time series, we might have motion capture data, and perhaps the thing that most started this work was patients' drug responses. So of course, people are different and they respond in different ways to drug responses. But what the anesthetist is faced is they're actually trying to identify the correct dosage and dose pattern for the patient. And it's interesting to think, well, how can we characterize that patient and how does that then help us predict the patient's responses to drugs? So the issue, of course, as motivated by this problem is that there's intersequence variation. So different people, or if we're talking about retail sales, different products or different organizations. And what the model that we're going to have here is a hierarchical multitask model that customizes the model to individual sequences. And perhaps the alternative is, well, the two alternatives are either sort of a one-size-fits-all pooled approach that lumps all the training sequences together, or a single task model that models each, let's call it each patient separately. But of course, the problem there is it fails to sort of share statistical strength across the different patients if we do that. So graphically, in the multi-task dynamical systems approach, we're going to have some training set, and we're going to sort of learn some latent variables that characterize the kinds of different patterns we see across, let's say, different patients. And then when we come to test patients, we'll sort of identify where on the model manifold each of those test examples is, and that will allow us to make predictions for them that are sort of customized. And in contrast, the pooled approach, basically you take all your training set, you build a model, and then you test on some examples and make predictions, but there isn't an explicit sort of identification of this kind of point in the model manifold where we're considering. Okay, so I think the advantages of the multitask dynamical systems approach are that we get explicit customization, and we'll talk about this in a minute, and we can allow unsupervised adaptation of novel tasks. This latent variables that we create can be used for visualization, and we can also do some quite nice end user control. Say in motion capture data, we can morph between different styles. Hopefully I'll have time to show you a video of that. So the rest of the talk, want to explain multitask dynamical systems, both multitask linear dynamical systems and also recurrent neural networks. In these models, we have to do learning inference. We'll talk briefly about related work, and we'll talk about 3 examples, sort of toy example, damped harmonic oscillator, motion capture data, which can be quite fun, and also the drug response data, which, as I say, really motivated this work. So in a multitask dynamical system, we're going to have some inputs, or these are control signals. So in the usual notation, these will be denoted by U, and we'll also have some observations, some outputs denoted by Y. And what we have is an underlying dynamical system. So for example, equation 3, we've got some X's that are evolving in time, and then we make the observation of Y's that hang off that latent dynamical system of the X's. And the key thing about the multitask dynamical system is, as per equations 1 and 2, we have some latent variable Z for the sequence. So this is for the whole for each sequence, we have an individual Z. And then the parameters of the model depend on those Z's by equation 2, by this sort of H sub phi. So there's some parameters phi in this model that maps from the Z's, which we can think of as low dimensional, to the thetas, which are what we need to specify for the model in equations 3 and 4. And graphically, what's happening there is that on the left, we've got a single task, so that there's a different theta for each sequence, and there's very little sharing. On the right, basically, it's pooled that we share the same theta for all the sequences. But what's happening in the middle is that we've got got a latent z that, depending on the parameters, these parameters phi, creates a theta for each individual sequence. For a linear dynamical system, I think hopefully, well, I expect that this kind of equation will be very familiar to many of you. We've just got a linear dependence of xt on xt minus 1 and the controls u of t. But notice that the matrix A and B and the offsets B, etc., depend on Z, depend on the latent variable. Okay, so that's, and also for the Y's. So this is just customizing the linear dynamical system by allowing these dynamics to depend on a latent variable Z. Yeah, and one thing that we might want to worry about is actually, we typically want to have stability of the dynamical system, so we have to parameterize the matrix A to have 2 norm less than 1, and that can be done due to, we can rotate the factors in the linear dynamical system, so we can parameterize it by a diagonal matrix sigma and a rotation matrix Q, and you can basically control the eigenvalues of this by parameterizing sigma as a diagonal matrix with entries that are tan-h's of some other variable v, and that means that these will be constrained between +1 and -1. In a multitask recurrent neural network, we just have a standard recurrent neural network with these tan-h nonlinearities. Again, though, that the various matrices and biases in this can depend on Z. And here we're going to use an affine model, H of Z for simplicity. And notice here that actually we've got deterministic state evolution. We're not having stochastic state evolution, which makes some of the inference problems easier. And although I'm describing this from a sort of standard recurrent neural network, we can also use LSTMs or GRUs. And in fact, we will use a GRU later in the experiments. So that's great. We've got a linear dynamical system or a recurrent neural network, and we want to parameterize that in terms of these latent variables Z. So how are we going to do that? So we want, if you remember, that phi is the parameters for this mapping H of Z that maps between the low dimensional Z to the parameters theta of the model. So we want to, the natural way to do this is to maximize the marginal likelihood. So if we've got a bunch of sequences indexed by I, we want to maximize the sum of the log probs of the Y's given the U's and the Phi's. And of course, when we expand that a little bit, we have to integrate out over P of Z. Okay, we've got this prior P of Z, and the thetas are the H of sub phi of Z. So that's what we want to do. Generally, that integral will be intractable, but we can approximate it with a variational posterior Q of Z to get the evidence lower bound or elbow. This is just fairly standard approaches in machine learning. And then we want to optimize this lower bound. So that's what was done. The other thing we want to do is we want to do online inference for Z, right? So as we are seeing a new sequence, a test sequence, we want to figure out what the right posterior in Z space is for it. And basically, obviously, as we can have a recursive model. We've seen data on, for the right here, P of Z from Y is equal to 1 up to T, but then we actually, want to add a new observation, YT plus 1. We want to update this posterior. And to do this, we use adaptive importance sampling from Capet et al. 2008. And we have a proposal distribution that's improved by some number of adaptive importance sampling iterations. Okay, so that's briefly how we do online inference to Z. Okay, so you're saying, right, multitask learning, what's the related work? Well, there's a whole bunch of course, multitask learning for supervised learning. That's perhaps a very familiar place, and that's sort of relevant, but we're really interested here in time series. We can do sometimes, if we have side information about these different tasks, we can do supervised adaptation. We can have some sort of task descriptor, and we can do this through initial state customization, or often one thing that's done is bias customization. So we talked in general how parts of that dynamical system can be changed in respect to, say, Z or some task descriptor, and a sort of more limited way of doing that is just to update those biases in the models, and we're going to sort of contrast sort of full adaptation compared to bias customization. But of course, the other thing to say is that when we have task descriptors, this side information is not always available, or indeed it may not always be very informative about the dynamics. We'll see an example of that right at the end. So we can also do unsupervised bias customization. So there are examples here by Miladinovich, etc. Of course, another version of such a model is to use a discrete latent variable, and we can have clustering of time series dynamics. There's quite a lot of examples of that, although of course that may make morphing between states. It's not really the same thing in that case. Also, of course, I've worked quite a lot on Gaussian processes, but multitask Gaussian processes are really, they work as a linear combination of latent functions, whereas what we can have in this parameterization of the multitask dynamical system is maybe we have a sort of non-linear control of the dynamics, and we'll see an example of that for the damped harmonic oscillators. And the other thing is, okay, yes, there's quite a lot of work in statistical models where we can talk about hierarchical models, so we can have a prior over, say, the different parameters, and there's perhaps some vague prior there. I think that the thing that's different here is we're trying to use a much more concentrated and focused prior. The idea that there are correlations between the different parameters that are actually needed to fit these models, so we can use a sort of low dimensional Z to characterize the space of variation in the parameter space. So that's what's going on there. Okay, so the first example of this is the damped harmonic oscillator. This is really a sort of toy example to make sure that things were working fine. And so we might have a simple single damped harmonic oscillator as shown on the top, which has basically a frequency and a decay rate. So in the equation below, that's the frequency omega and the decay rate rho. And then we're going to actually combine two different damped harmonic oscillators, and that can give quite an interesting variety of outputs as shown in the lower plot, the lower row there. So we're observing the sum of two damped harmonic oscillators. We've got some 4D parameter space, and we also basically have a 4D state space because each damped harmonic oscillator is a second order differential system, but it also works as a second order discrete time system. So we have 2 degrees of freedom in the state space for each oscillator, so therefore 4 in total. So the MTDS model looks like this. We've got a 4-dimensional Z because we know that basically there are these 4 parameters. And so the different parameters of the linear dynamical system are functions of Z. And here we've got the dynamics. X of t is a sub z of x of t minus 1. And as we said, there's no noise in this case. This is a deterministic evolution, and the y's can have observation noise, and as usual have a linear observation model, which here will just allow us to sum the different waveforms. So we have this over time. We're actually using here a multi-layer perceptron for H sub phi, and as I mentioned earlier, we're constraining A so that the result is stable. So what we can see is, if we consider a different prediction task, so what we want to do is we want to do inference for the Zs, as I described, and here we sample Z from the posterior, and then we can observe the predictions that are made. And in this, the ground truth data is shown dashed, and the predictions are in orange. And what's happening as we go across from left to right in the figure is that we are basically seeing more of the data. So we're allowing us to characterize Z better. And as you can see, that makes tighter predictions and reduces the error bars as you'd expect as time goes on. So that's sort of working nicely. And indeed, you can look at these predictions, and so this is these on the bottom. We've got time observed at 10, 20, or 40, and we got the predictive root mean squared error on the y-axis. And basically, what we can see is, say that if we compare with the gray, which is the light gray, the single task learning, which does learn eventually at that when we get to say 40. It was observations at time 40, but actually is quite a lot poorer at earlier times, while the multitask learning learns quicker, as you'd expect. And what we can see here in the cohort model is actually that's quite poor, and that's because actually here we're fitting a rather restricted model, a single linear dynamical system, and that really can't handle the variety of experience that will go on across those different parameters. Okay, and it's also the case that the MTLDS outperforms pooled and biased customized recurrent neural nets and GIUs. So that's just an example of it working on a sort of toy problem to gain confidence. A fun kind of data set to work on is motion capture data. So we're considering mocap data for 8 different walking styles from Ian Mason in 2018, and each Y of T is a 21 joint skeleton centered at the root joint, which is at the sort of base of the spine. And so we've got like the X, Y, and Z locations of each of these 21 joints, and the control signals are basically, that the person is walking on a particular trajectory. So actually, the 1 second head trajectory and gait phase are used as sort of control signals for the walking. And what we're trying to do is to customize. We learn basically about these different styles of walking, given little segments of data walking in these different styles. So the kind of architecture here is to have use the control signals to have quite a high state dimension initially, a sort of general purpose gated recurrent unit with 1024 units, and then a kind of bottleneck between that general purpose GRU and a customized multitask recurrent neural network. And so this bottleneck here is actually to a dimension of 24. So we're sort of having a linear transformation, but with a bottleneck in there. So a sort of low rank transformation. And this customization, the H sub phi of Z is affine, and we'll call that the dimension of Z is K. So I'm showing you here the results of a t-SNE visualization of the 8-dimensional Zs. And so we basically divide each sequence of motions up into 64 frame segments, and each little dot here is the mean embedding for each sequence. And what we can see in the t-SNE plot is the kind of structure you'd hope, that basically you see that the the different styles of walking have mapped to sort of different places in Z space. So we can get a latent characterization of those styles. And we can also, and I'll show you a video of this in a minute, we can actually interpolate in this space as well. We can sort of morph from one kind of walking to another. So yeah, that's fun. The other thing we can do, as well as having fun with morphing, we can also say, well, does this actually help us learn about the, if we have novel test sequences, can we make better predictions for those based on perhaps a relatively small amount of data? So this plot on the x-axis shows the fraction of the training set available, and on the y-axis it shows the average mean squared error. So if we perhaps start with the single task learning, that's the top line, the black line, then that has a relatively high mean squared error initially, and as we see more data, it does better. But if we compare that with, say, the orange line, the MTDS with k is equal to 7, what we see is that quite rapidly learns. And, you know, so when we had, for example, say about 0.1 of the data set, we're already getting much better performance. And although they all converge to the optimal result in the end, basically we get there faster because we can share this statistical strength. And I should have mentioned that this quantity on the y-axis is the test performance for held out sequences for each style. So that's how we evaluate this. The other thing we can do is that we can, you know, give it novel test data. So we've got 8 styles. We can do leave 1 out. So we can train on 7 styles, test on 1. And what this plot is showing is on the x-axis the prediction frame, and on the y-axis is the test mean squared error. And so what we see is for something like a GRU without customization, you know, this grows very rapidly. That's like the green line or the blue line, whereas for the multi-task dynamical system, that's shown in orange, where that's actually stabilizing much better. And if we do bias customization, that does a bit worse. So let me see if I can switch slides to show you the video of the style morphing. Hopefully this will all work. Let me see, share screen. Yes. So I hope this will work over the internet. So what we're doing is we're going to have 2 different styles. Say, for example, on the left, we've got the neutral style. On the right, we've got the sort of depressed style. And what's happening in the middle is we're morphing from the thing on the left to the thing on the right. So start off here being neutral and end up depressed. In this case, we start off being depressed and we end up in the childlike style. You can see the childlike style has this arm swinging. So as we morph between these, we see more arm swinging in the middle as we morph. And there are other examples like this. Perhaps we don't need to do them all, but yeah, we see how we can morph in the latent space, which is fun. Okay, so let me stop sharing that and come back to the slides. You can get the right ones. Yeah. I can't quite see the right ones at the moment. Nope. Not quite sure what's happening at the moment. Forgive me, I'll stop sharing and try again. Hopefully this will work. Okay, can you see the slides that we were looking at before?
No.
Okay, nor can I. Okay, okay. Let me see what happened. Maybe I killed them. That's possible. Okay, let me just do this. Okay.
Yeah, they're back.
Okay, they're back. Okay, great, good. So the other task we applied this to is drug response data. So here we've got a patient responding to an anesthetic, propofol, and we've got some vital signs measurements like systolic and diastolic blood pressure on the top, and also the bispectral index, which is a measure of unconsciousness, which is quite an important thing to be trying to assess if you're anesthetizing a patient. And at the bottom, we're also showing the sort of level of infusion of the drug. So in this case, there's a sort of low, high, low sequence that's done. We start off with a relatively low amount of anesthetic. We then bump that up to a high level, then drop down again. And there are other design sequences that are possible. So this fits into so-called PK/PD modeling. So we have pharmacokinetics modeling the drug concentration in various sort of notional compartments. So there might be, say, the bloodstream, and we've got just a differential equation, which is about the, basically, we've got here, if X is the so-called effect site, then we might be getting drug from the central compartment, but we're also excreting the drug with this Ke0. So that's the dynamics, or the kinetics, sorry. And then pharmacodynamics relates to the relationship between the effect site concentration and the vital signs. So how does the drug concentration affect things like blood pressure, etc.? Here we're going to model that with a nonlinear function G that depends on this effect site concentration X. Now, there's a large literature on PK/PD modeling. And one thing we can consider is basically a sort of non-linear model which can be comprised of a basis of sigmoid functions. And by choosing that, we can actually get monotonicity of this response, which is something that we will know about, how the response should vary as a function of the drug concentration. And so we basically, by discretizing the ODE, we get some linear state dynamics. We also have here, so the X of t has these controls, and also the Y is this nonlinear function G of the concentration X, but also with potential offsets and so on like this. So basically all these alphas and betas and also the etas are the parameters of this model, which we're going to model as a as h sub phi of z. And we're basically going to have something like a factor analysis model. So this is just linear in the z's, but if there are constraints on parameters, maybe to enforce positivity or so on, we'll make use of element-wise functions to enforce those parameter constraints. So the drug for this, the data for this was sequences of drug infusions from 40 patients at the Golden Jubilee National Hospital in Glasgow. This was actually research done by Chris Hawthorne. We have these 3 observation channels, and the input is a continuous infusion of propofol anesthetic using a target-controlled infusion pump. And there were some obvious artifacts present in these signals, which were annotated and removed with clinical guidance. So if I sort of skip back to these plots, you'll see that, for example, there's some gaps in the sequences, and there are also some perhaps outlying observations as well. One other thing I mentioned is that we can have, when we're doing multitask learning, we can have something like a task descriptor. And in this case, it would be the height, the weight, the age, and the gender of the patient, and also we can derive the BMI from these parameters. So what we want to do is basically consider as as we apply an input sequence of anesthetic, we want to predict how the patient will respond to that. So in these plots, the x-axis is time, and the y-axis is some a vital sign, probably in this case the bispectral index. And what we're seeing is in blue the actual patient's response, and in green we're seeing so-called cohort or pooled model, whereas we're seeing the multitask learning model in red, both the mean predictions and also the error bars. And as you'd expect, as we see more data, we can, at least for the multitask learning model, we can kind of focus down, we can learn the Z that's appropriate, and we can make tighter predictions, and also predictions that actually cover the data, which is kind of nice. And so we can see that sort of, in this example, the MTL is doing better than the cohort model. And so we can, just to go into a bit more detail, we can use the pharmacodynamic model of White et al. Which is already using some personalization based on the patient covariates. We can use multitask models for subspace dimensions of 5 and 7, and we can compute the root mean square error for these predictions for 40 patients using a leave one out approach. And we're reporting the SRMSE, the ratio of RMSE to the optimal in-sample fit. And we're considering this at 5 and 10 minutes ahead prediction windows. So there's a bunch of competitors. We've got the pooled or cohort model, the single task learning. We've got the task descriptor model. Essentially, we're predicting the thetas from the covariates rather than from a latent variable. We can also use an LSTM, although I think that, given all the work that's gone into PKPD modeling and the whole literature, I think that anesthetists might be quite concerned about a sort of black box model like an LSTM, which is, of course, an issue about the potential uptake of how different methods might be uptaken in by the medics. So quite a lot of results here, perhaps rather more than we can go into, but the sort of basic message here is that for the systolic and diastolic blood pressures, then at both of these time intervals, then the MTDS models are actually performing generally the best. I guess for the diastolic, we see a little bit of improvement of the customized pooled method, but generally the LSTM method, the MTDS methods are performing well. For the bispectral index, certainly at the later time, we see the MTDS is performing the best, although it's sort of worth noting here that, in fact, here the LSTM is actually performing better than the MTDS model. And this is perhaps due to some specification of the PD model for BIS, so that you see these sort of step changes in the BIS response. So maybe to summarize, and hopefully I've left a few minutes for questions, that we're interested in hierarchical multitask models that customize time series models to different people or different organizations and so on. We've seen examples of this for a damped harmonic oscillator, for mocap data, and for drug response data. And I think the advantages of this are that we have explicit customization. If we have a big neural network, maybe it can remember these different kind of sequences, but we don't have sort of explicit control over that. And we can do unsupervised adaptation to novel tasks. We've seen we get some visualization of these task descriptors, and we can also have end user control like morphing. So let me stop there and take any questions. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. That was a very interesting talk, and we have a few minutes for questions. And I think I'd like to start one off myself. I found it very interesting when you were showing the interpolations between the different gates, and I'm just wondering if you could give me your thoughts on whether this multitask modeling approach improves model generalization compared to simply pooling the different tasks together.
Right. Yep. Okay. I think that, let me just find the slide. I'm just sort of thinking back. I think that we are actually, okay, so well, let me give the caveat. We're not experimenting on this sort of morphing task, right? But what I presented in this slide is that we looked at we've got some test set performance. So for each style, we've got some held out sequences, and we can see that, for example, if we use a relatively low fraction of the training set for training such models, then the MTDS shown in orange is getting better predictive performance than the competitors. It is true that when we've got more data, actually they all sort of converge to the optimal level. But certainly we demonstrated here that this this can help. And I think also in this other slide, when we did this sort of leave one out thing, then again we could show that the multitask, when we do inference with the Z, was able to do a lot better than these sort of pooled models that are shown here in blue and green. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, thank you.
Great.
If there's no questions at the moment, I would like to ask one more. When I was reading up on your work, I noticed that you guys seem to have been the first people experimenting with multitask learning on time series data, or one of the first groups. Are there any peculiarities to time series data that normal learning tasks might not have? For example, I noticed that the first two tasks, the damped harmonic oscillator and the gate, were both very periodic in nature.
Yeah, that's a nice question. I don't know if certainly I don't think it's restricted to periodic kind of motions. Perhaps that it's just these are nice examples. I have to say that the mocap data is actually a lot of fun to work with, right? Because you can have these skeletons and you can watch them, and you can see if things go wrong, like if you had unstable dynamics, you could see this. It would be quite funny. So I certainly don't think that these are restricted to harmonic motions. I think we just those are just examples that we came up with, and it would certainly be interesting to consider other I guess that I was wondering, so because sales data may have, well, it certainly has periodicities, and if we think about for example, I don't know, electricity demand as well, of course it has there are various periods in that, as well as sort of exceptional events often that come from like holidays and things like that. So I guess it's really a question of what does sort of generic time series data look like? To what extent is it periodic? How do we sample that to get examples? Certainly, I think though we've seen in the PKPD model, it doesn't have to have that periodicity, but it certainly can do. I hope that's a reasonable answer.
Yeah, thank you. Well, we have time for one more question. Professor Roderick Murray-Smith, who is our local machine learning professor, in case anyone doesn't know him for some reason.
Yes, thanks a lot. I was interested in what you were getting at when you were mentioning that some of your partners might not have been enthusiastic about black box recurrent neural network. Even I'm guessing that your models were implemented in Python and that one. That may still be something that's quite challenging for some partners to work with. So I was wondering if you had any examples of some war stories from collaboration with other areas, about what you did to make the impact last beyond the immediate grant, or whatever was how they work. So how did you get people to really keep using the fancy computer standards tools that you're creating? Okay,
so the sound was quite poor there, but if I've understood, and maybe I'll just repeat the sort of question, so see if I've got it right. I think you're asking about how do people get ownership, say domain scientists get ownership of these techniques beyond the sort of maybe the initial project? Is that right?
Yes, especially in terms of the software, that if you're using frameworks that they're less comfortable or familiar with, and as soon as the expertise from your group walks away at the end of the PhD or whatever, how do they keep it alive? How do they get the understanding and keep using it?
That's of course a very good question. I think that there are sort of various answers to that. Of course, to some extent, we would hope that the domain experts sort of take this stuff on board, although of course they won't necessarily become computer scientists overnight. So of course, one thing is making more sort of production level software rather than just research level software. So if you often it's useful in grants to have some time for that final stage, right? And of course, the increasing use of GitHub and other repositories like this and making software available helps for this, but often, so if you put some effort into making research level code, that helps. But of course, I think the other thing is that perhaps it's to recognize that we will need ongoing collaborations between domain scientists and data scientists. And I think for us, that's where something like the data science unit can help. In that at least if people can write into subsequent grants something like a 20% post for a data scientist, then potentially we can support that better, right? Because you're absolutely right about the sort of the idea behind the question. That one can get these things in certain once when you're working together, but how will that continue? So I think that one way to support this is through that kind of interaction. My personal view is that in the long run, we actually should see the development of expertise in different domain sciences. That I think it will become necessary for those domain sciences to have data scientists who are sort of experts in the types of techniques that are used in that science, in the same way that we might have lab techs in chemistry and other sort of staff that support the research. I think the same thing may actually be true in the end about AI for science, but I think that obviously we're a long way from that, and one of the issues about this is actually career paths for such data scientists. I think that's certainly an issue, although I think that's improving. In the same way that we've had career paths for research software engineers that have been developed, say, over the last decade or so, I think we need to have a recognition of this potential. I think that can actually be quite a fun job, a sort of, it's like doing data science consultancy, but rather than doing it to sell toothpaste, you're doing it for scientific discovery. And I think I certainly know between those two which I'd prefer to do. So yeah, hopefully that answers your question, Rob.
Thanks, Chris.
Thank you for the questions. And thank you for your excellent talk once again, Professor Williams.
Well, thank you for the invitation. As I say, I'm sorry not to be there in person, but I hope you have a great meeting in the rest of the day.
Thank you.